Was Mary really a virgin? Well, hello again. Welcome to another video and welcome back. Not sure why I'm saying welcome back to you. I don't think that you went anywhere, but I took a bit of a break. I actually had this video written out and ready to go before Christmas, and now here we are in the, I guess, the second week of the new year. Yeah, I took a break and then I had some just basic technology, logistical issues getting things back together again. But here we are. New year. I hope you're doing well. I hope you had an opportunity for a good break over the Christmas time and over the New Year period. I hope that you are healthy and doing well and excited and desiring to know God more this coming year. So what we are talking about today in this video is a somewhat Christmas-themed Christian doctrine. We are talking about the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. And what I want to look at more specifically in this video is a challenge to the prophesied virgin birth, a challenge to the claim that Jesus was born of a virgin, and I want to look at how, as Christians, we might respond to such a challenge. So we're looking today at a Bible passage from the book of Isaiah, from the Old Testament, of course. The book of Isaiah was written somewhere around 600, 700 BC, somewhere in around there. And it was written, of course, to the people of Israel. And it offers this prophecy regarding the virgin birth. If we look here, this is the 7th chapter of Isaiah. And we're looking, I have it highlighted here, verse 14. So Isaiah 7 and verse 14, and the text reads, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and she will name him Emmanuel." Okay, so that's the verse in question. And now the challenge to this passage, I've heard it a few times from a few different sources. You may have heard it too. But the challenge to this passage is that the word virgin, found there in verse 14, the word virgin is, of course, originally written in the Hebrew language. But they will look at this passage and they'll say that word virgin, in fact, the word doesn't literally mean virgin. The word literally means young girl. That's what the Hebrew word means. And they then sometimes will look at this passage and kind of build upon this challenge to the doctrine. And they'll say, well, so just reading the text, though, which sounds more likely? Just from a basic common sense kind of an interpretation, what does it sound more likely to have happened? That a virgin gives birth to a son, which we know is impossible in a naturalistic sense. A virgin gives birth to a son, or a young girl gives birth to a son. Just reading those two possibilities and maybe, setting them side by side, which sounds more realistic, which sounds more sensible. And of course, the nature of the challenge is that most people are going to say, well, given those two choices, I guess a young girl giving birth to a son sounds more normal, I guess, sounds more believable. I don't know how exactly you would express that. So that's one part of the challenge, the wording, the use of the word, and the what would be the most common sense interpretation of that word. Some folks will add to that challenge and take it even a little further, with this secondary idea that the doctrine of the virgin birth was something that was just dreamed up and exaggerated and marketed, I guess you could say, by the early church. And I think of this type of an argument, the way I kind of label it in my mind is like Da Vinci Code theology. I don't know if you remember the movie from a few years back. Tom Hanks was in the movie. I read the book. I actually quite enjoyed the book. It was a good read. It was entertaining to read, but it was a work of fiction. It was a fictional book. It was written as a fictional book. But part of the plot included this idea that prominent points of core Christian doctrine were basically dreamed up during the early church councils. So the idea presented in the book is that all these people sat around a table, and I guess they pitched in ideas about what would make a cool or interesting religion, and the best ideas, the ones that everybody liked, stayed in, including, I guess, the virgin birth. So the claim is that the doctrine of the virgin birth was just, I guess, one of these creative ideas that somebody came up with in the early church, and someone said, hey, that's interesting, I like that has a certain ring to it, and it stayed in, it made it through the vote, and it picked up momentum from there, and that's why 2,000 years later, that's why it's still in. That's why we think a virgin gave birth to a son. So that's the challenge. So how would we as Christians respond to that? Type all in caps on social media, maybe? Well, the very first thing that I would do with this challenge, if we run back to Isaiah chapter 7 that we were talking about, let's talk first up. Let's talk about the semantics for Isaiah 7. So Isaiah 7 and verse 14, as we mentioned, the Hebrew word that is used for virgin, that is translated virgin here in the text, is the Hebrew word alma. And if we cut over here to, this is Strong's here, and it's just taking an age to come up for some reason. There we go. So the word alma in Hebrew, as I said, that's the word that is employed in Isaiah 7 and verse 14. And you can see here the definitions of that word are a young woman and a virgin. So what does that mean? Just so you understand what we're seeing on the screen here, what that is saying is essentially that the Hebrew word alma has two legitimate English translations, a young woman or a virgin, right? They're both legitimate translations of the word. So, hey, we're both right. We're both right. Alma can mean either one. It can mean a young woman. It can also mean a virgin. And this actually, this etymology of the word here originates back from Hebrew culture. I could go on a rant here about, I guess, declining moral value in society, but I'll resist the urge. But the word here, the word meaning, was rooted in ancient Hebrew culture, where a young woman and a virgin were seen as synonymous. If you were a young woman, you were most likely a virgin. So that's why this word exists the way it does, with kind of dual meaning, with either one in English being a legitimate translation just from a language, just from a semantic perspective. But in terms of Christian doctrine, we want to understand which one should be the correct word, because from a doctrine perspective, those are pretty different things, right? We want to know, in our theology, in our belief system, we want to know, did a young woman give birth to a son, or did a virgin give birth to a son, right? We want to make sure we're believing the right thing. So even though from a semantic perspective, we can just throw up our hands and say, well, it could be either one, well, true, but we want to understand which one is the intended correct meaning. But while we're talking about language here, the other thing that we can address, the idea that the virgin birth was something dreamed up and marketed by the early church, I think is probably the weakest part of this challenge, and something that we can address quite quickly and quite easily through the Septuagint. And now the Septuagint, if you're not familiar with it, if you don't know what it is, essentially, the Septuagint was a translation of the Old Testament scriptures. The Old Testament scriptures, of course, written in Hebrew. So it was a translation from Hebrew into the Greek language. And this was something that was done somewhere around 300 or 400 BC. So a bunch of Hebrew scholars got together. They took their Old Testament Hebrew scriptures of the day, and they translated them into Greek, which was, by and large, the language of the day at the time. And so if we look at the Septuagint, and we look at Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, my computer seems to be really having a rough time when I switch tabs here, but I don't know, maybe the YouTube break hit my computer hard. I don't know. But anyway, so this is, I'll tell you what this is. So this is the Septuagint online. Someone has taken the Greek language Septuagint. As I said, the Septuagint was a translation from Hebrew to Greek. And then what you're looking at here on the page is, in the present day, someone has taken that Greek Septuagint text and translated it again into English. And you can see here Isaiah 7 and verse 14 in the Septuagint. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive in the womb, and shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. So why does this matter? Of what relevance is this? Well, I think what this does is it refutes the idea of the virgin birth being a doctrine that was somehow dreamed up by the early church, being some sort of invention of the early church. Because what we see here in the Septuagint, and like I said, this was a work done by Hebrew scholars around 300-400 BC, and what they did was they took the Hebrew word alma, as they were translating, as I said, Hebrew into Greek. They took the Hebrew word alma and they translated it into the Greek word parthenos, which as I also said, somebody has then taken the Greek here and translated it into English. But the Greek word parthenos is interesting because the Greek parthenos undoubtedly means virgin. So that the Hebrew alma, as we talked about, there are a couple of different meanings of the word. But the Greek parthenos, that's not true. That's not the case. The Greek parthenos only means virgin. Like there's no controversy here. There's no doubt. There's no discussion. The Greek parthenos absolutely 100% means virgin. So what we're seeing here is that 300-400 BC, Hebrew scholars translated the Hebrew text, and they translated Isaiah 7 and verse 14 into the Greek word for virgin. So this was decided not by the early Christian church. This was translated hundreds of years before the Christian church even existed. So was the virgin birth a early church invention? No, absolutely not. But even then, we could say, okay, fair enough. The virgin birth was not a doctrine invented by the early church, fair enough. But we could still say, well, so maybe this wasn't a deliberate invention. Maybe nobody set out to invent the doctrine, but maybe it was just an honest mistake, right? Maybe they just mistranslated the Hebrew text. They got it wrong. They made an honest mistake, and having made an honest mistake, then things just kind of snowballed from there. One thing led to another, and here we are. That's a possibility. So if we consider that for a minute, consider that idea, there's a couple of places I would go to in the Old Testament scriptures to really broaden out this doctrine, to really explore the doctrine of the virgin birth, because I don't think the doctrine just rests on this translation of one word in Isaiah chapter 7. I think the doctrine exists more broadly than that. The first place that I would go to explore this idea, if we go to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 here, and verse 15 reads, and I will make enemies of you and the woman, and of your offspring and her descendant. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So some context here. Many of us know about Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve in the garden, forbidden from eating the fruit from the one tree. And they, of course, immediately mess that up, and they eat the fruit from the tree. And then God comes and speaks to them, and he utters these prophetic words. Genesis 3, verse 15 again, and I will make enemies of you and the woman, and of your offspring and of her descendant. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now, what's really interesting here about this passage in Genesis, we know quite clearly that this is a prophetic word from God, and the word from God is in regard to the descendant who is Jesus Christ, who ultimately would come into the world and would strike Satan on the head, to use God's mode of language here. But the interesting thing here in this passage, the word descendant here, let's look at some more Hebrew. The word for descendant here is the Hebrew zerah. And if I flip to another tab, I'm assuming it's going to churn for 15 minutes like it has. Yep, strange. No big deal. Yes, so the word for descendant here in Genesis 3 and verse 15 is the Hebrew word zerah, and the definitions listed here are a sowing, seed, or offspring. So quite a range of meanings there. One of them, of course, legitimate meaning as well is descendant, which is the word that was used in Genesis there. And we see the word zerah used in that context in a few other places in Genesis. So if we jump to Genesis chapter 9, we find God speaking to Noah. And here in Genesis 9, verses 8, let's just read verse 9. God says to Noah, "Behold, I myself am establishing my covenant with you and with your descendants after you." It's the exact same word, exact same Hebrew word, the word zerah. We see the same word used again in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12, a little further on in history, verse 7, the text reads, "And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.'" Again, same Hebrew word, zerah, and the same meaning, right? Same basic meaning. We're referring to biological descendants. But as we said, when we looked at the definition, the word zerah has a broad range of meanings. And one of the words listed there was seed. And when we think of the word seed, there's a more, I'll say, biologically based meaning of the word that is also a valid translation of the Hebrew zerah. Let's jump to Leviticus chapter 15. Looks like I'm a little too far down here. There we go. Leviticus 15 and verse 17 there. The text reads, "As for any garment or any leather on which there is a seminal emission, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening." Seminal emissions. We just don't get to talk about that enough, do we, in Bible studies? But the reason I bring it up is not just to be weird. I bring it up because seminal emission, exact same Hebrew word, zerah. So seed in that sense is another legitimate definition of the Hebrew word zerah. Why does any of this matter? Why are we talking about this? Well, as I said, there's a whole range of meanings to the word, but what's really interesting when we think about the word meaning is that when we think through the Old Testament, we think about the idea of lineage, of descendants through the Old Testament text, and as it's used through the Hebrew language, the word zerah is always used to describe male lineage because of the biological aspect to the word that we also just looked at. And we saw that, right? Through Noah, through the male descendant, through Abraham, through the male descendant. It's always through the male lineage. Except for here in Genesis chapter 3. Because in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, it talks about making enemies of you, of the woman, and of your offspring, and her descendant. The descendant of the woman. The seed of the woman, in fact, considering the biological aspect of the word that we just talked about, the seed of the woman, the descendant of the woman, actually doesn't make biological sense, because biologically women don't have seed in that biological sense, right? It reads wrong. It reads odd. Somebody hearing this prophecy uttered in the native Hebrew language would hear it and would immediately think, that sounds weird. Why didn't God say his descendant? Because we know from the text, right, that Adam was standing right here when this happened. God is speaking to Adam and Eve, but then when he starts to talk about descendants, he talks about the descendant of the woman. He talks about the seed of the woman. So we might say that this very first reference to the coming Christ, the very first reference in the entire Bible, the text hints to us that there's going to be something odd about this birth. This isn't going to be a birth the way that births typically take place from a biological standpoint, right? You could even go further and say there's going to be something unique about this birth biologically, in the sense of normative male and female roles, right? There's something weird about this birth, because normally we would be talking about the male seed in regard to this birth. We're not talking about the male seed. We're talking about the female seed. It's strange. It doesn't quite fit together. It's calling out the fact that, there's something strange is going to go on here, something out of the ordinary. Now, you could say, well, okay, John, that's a big jump though, right? You can't really read the prophecy here in Genesis 15 and say, so this is a virgin birth, right? That's a big jump. That's a big jump to get from Genesis 3 verse 15 and land on a virgin birth. That's you're jumping over a lot of ground there, right? It's really reaching. Well, I'm not really going that far, right? I'm not saying that you'll read Genesis 3 verse 15 and immediately think, oh, virgin birth, interesting. I'm not saying that Adam and Eve heard this prophecy and thought, virgin birth. I'm not going that far, but we know more often than not that God chooses to reveal things gradually over a period of time. So I don't think Genesis 3 explicitly calls out a virgin birth, but I do think perhaps Genesis chapter 3 hints at it. And then when Christ was actually born, or even for us 2,000 years further on, we can read about the doctrine of the virgin birth, and we can read all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, and while it isn't explicitly drawn out in the text, we can see the shadow of it hinted at from the very beginning. So that's Genesis. That's Genesis chapter 3. The other place that I would like to look at as we explore this point of doctrine is all the way back where we started in Isaiah chapter 7. So, of course, we looked at this verse already, Isaiah 7 and verse 14, and we talked about what it says. And then we pitched the question, if you remember, which is the more likely interpretation? Are we talking here in this verse about a virgin bearing a son, or are we talking about in this verse of a young girl bearing a son? And honestly, I think the answer to that question, I think in this passage, the strongest argument the best interpretation is the word virgin. I think virgin is the most likely interpretation of the text. What makes me say that? Well, we looked at the one verse, right? We looked at the verse 14. But if we zoom out a little bit from that verse and we look at the broader passage here, as we said earlier, this passage was written maybe 600 or 700 years before Christ came. The passage was written to the nation of Israel, as we know. If we look at verse 10, say, God is speaking to Ahaz. Ahaz was the king at the time, and God comes and he speaks to Ahaz, and God invites Ahaz. He says, Ahaz, ask me for a sign. Ask me for a sign that I'm doing something major in the nation of Israel, through the nation of Israel. So there's an invitation here, right? There's an invitation from God. Ask me for a sign. And I was going to say God is thinking big. I don't know what it means for God to, I guess, think big, because God doesn't think small, right? But in our terms, God is thinking big, because he says, as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. So the sense of this invitation is, Ahaz, go ahead, ask me for a sign, ask me for something amazing, ask me for something incredible, ask me for something unprecedented, something that we've never seen before, something that's going to test your belief, something that's going to just bring forth your imagination, get your mind racing. This is the scenario that God is talking about here. Ahaz, go ahead, come up with an amazing sign and ask it of me, your God. And Ahaz responds with something that I think of as false piety. False piety, because in response to this invitation from God, Ahaz is kind of like, oh, far be it from me to put the Lord God to the test. I would never ordain, to the little old me would never dream of putting God to the test. And why do I call it false piety? Well, I call it false piety because Ahaz here is being all reverential of God, can't possibly put God to the test, but in doing so, he just directly disobeyed God, right? Because God just came to him and said, dude, ask me for a sign. The simple way forward here is, when God tells you to do something, do the thing. You don't argue with God about how, you're so devout, God, that you don't do that stuff. That, God, thank you for the invitation, but that's not me. I'm kind of above that. I don't do those type of things. Like, I think it's reasonable to say that God knows better than we do about who we are and about what we're like and about what we ought to do. So when God comes to you and says, ask me for a sign, ask him for a sign. Well, Ahaz doesn't do that. He as I said, this false piety. So in response, God says to him, all right, Ahaz, you don't want to come up with a sign. Okay, I will give you a sign. Here's the sign. Are you ready? And then we get to this verse 14 that we already read. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. That is the sign. So why would virgin be the most sensible interpretation of the word? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, the context of this passage is God saying, come up with a sign. And we talked about this, that make it an amazing sign. Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. God is inviting this incredible, brain-stretching sign. Well, if the correct interpretation of the word Alma in Isaiah 7 verse 14, if the correct interpretation is a young woman, why would that be an amazing sign? Because young girls give birth to sons all the time. So in the context of an amazing sign, something that actually happens naturally, often, would be really lame as an amazing sign, right? It doesn't stretch your imagination. It doesn't defy belief. It's not unprecedented, right? It happens all the time. And that brings me actually to my next point is, if the passage is only talking about a young girl giving birth to a son, then this is not only not a very amazing sign, it's a really, really terrible sign for the nation of Israel. If you think about what a sign is supposed to do, and I'm not just talking about a sign in a biblical sense. You can think of it as, a road sign as you're driving along the highway. What is a sign supposed to do? A sign is supposed to clearly convey information. A sign that does not convey information is not a good sign. And as we said, young girls give birth to sons all the time. So when God is saying to Ahaz here, here's a sign that I am going to do something big through the nation of Israel, and then he gives a sign that happens maybe thousands of times a year, how does that convey anything to Israel? It's a bit like, imagine this. It's a bit like God comes to you and he says, I'm going to do something big, something amazing in your life, but you have to be ready for it when it happens. So I'm going to give you a sign so that you know when it happens. Here's the sign. Are you ready? The sun will come out. That's a terrible sign, right? That's a terrible, it's a totally meaningless sign. It's completely unhelpful. There's nothing that you can do with that because the sun comes out all the time. So you're going to be on high alert every day of your life because you're waiting for this moving of God, and the sign you've been given happens over and over and over and over. So it's a horrendously bad sign. However, if the passage in Isaiah is referring to a virgin bearing a son, well, that would be completely different. That would be an amazing sign, yes. It would fit the context of what God was talking about because he was inviting Ahaz to come up with an amazing sign. It's amazing. It's unprecedented. And because it's unprecedented, it would be a clear sign because it had never happened before in the entire history of Israel. You don't find virgins giving birth to sons, right? It had never happened before. And as we read forward into the New Testament, into the Gospels, we read that the one time that it did happen, it marked the birth of Jesus Christ into the world. It marked the beginning of God's greatest work through the history of Israel and through to the rest of the world. So this is what I think regarding this passage in Isaiah chapter 7, Isaiah 7 and verse 14. I think the doctrine of the virgin birth is a true doctrine. I think the word virgin is correctly translated in Isaiah. I think it lines up perfectly with Genesis chapter 3, as we looked at. I think it lines up perfectly with the Septuagint, as we looked at. And I think the word makes sense in the natural reading and the context of the passage here in Isaiah. So, that is the virgin birth. That is what I think. I thank you for watching this video. Now that my leave of absence is over, I plan to get back to posting videos on a more regular basis. I do have a few ideas queued up and ready to go. Back before Christmas, I started a video teaching on the nature of Jesus Christ. I have a lot more that I would like to say on that. There's much, much more to consider. I'd like to get back to that. There are more ideas of Bible passages that the church often gets wrong. We have a teaching series on that, trying to right some all too common wrongs in biblical interpretation. I guess it's a sad thing, but I think there's plenty more to teach on there as well, and lots of other ideas that I'm looking forward to exploring. That is all for this time around. Again, thank you for watching. Happy New Year. I hope you're doing well. As per usual, if you agree, if you disagree, if you have other ideas for videos, feel free to drop me a line. Feel free to subscribe, drop a like, write a comment, do all the things. Happy to hear from you. Happy to talk to you. Happy to be back. Happy New Year. God bless you guys. Bye-bye.